The year was 1876, and the platform at the dusty Dakota station rattled beneath the hiss of the departing engine as Elias Boone stood with his hat in hand, his 2 young daughters clinging to the hem of his coat, their faces pale from both shyness and hope. He had told them only that someone was coming, a woman who might help them find warmth again in a house that had felt hollow since their mother's passing. And now, as the final passengers trickled from the train, he wondered if he had been a fool to pray that such a stranger could ever belong. The men at the freight office had already whispered about him. About a widower desperate enough to send for a bride who could not even speak, and the women shook their heads with pity. Yet Elias had pressed forward because the ranch was crumbling without a steady hand, and the girls were growing up too fast without tenderness. Then, as though the air itself held its breath, a slender figure stepped down from the car, her bonnet tugged low against the light, her eyes cast toward the ground, and in her small, pale hands she carried not a suitcase, but a battered slate board smeared with chalk dust. The crowd stirred with confusion, some smirking at the sight of her pinned tag that read, "Marielle Bride," while others muttered about fate and folly. But Elias saw the tremor in her shoulders, and knew she carried more fear than any of them could imagine. She reached the platform clerk, who asked her name, and when she failed to reply, his impatience sharpened, his voice rising with irritation. Still she did not speak, only lifted her trembling hands into the air, shaping a slow, deliberate motion, fingers sweeping against her chest as though drawing something invisible into herself. The gesture meant nothing to the clerk, who frowned and waved her away, but Elias felt his breath hitch. For somehow in the simple curve of her hands, he understood what she meant. "Home," he whispered under his breath, and when her gray eyes flicked toward him in startled recognition, he raised his own calloused fingers and clumsily mimicked her motion. The world seemed to still around them, the hiss of steam, the scrape of boots, even his daughter's small gasps, until there was only the fragile exchange of silence, and the word her hands had given him. Marielle's lips parted soundlessly, and for a moment she looked less like a frightened girl, and more like a soul who had been waiting her whole life to be seen. Elias stepped forward then, ignoring the snickers of townsfolk who muttered about cursed matches and desperate men, and extended his hand. She hesitated, clutching the slate board tighter, as though it carried secrets she could not surrender, but at last she placed her fingers in his, chalk dust smudging against his rough skin. The girls pressed closer, their wide eyes fixed on her every move, and Nora whispered, "Papa, what did she say?" Elias crouched to them, still holding Marielle's hand, and answered softly, "She said home." It was not only a word, not only a promise for them, but something that reached into his own hollow chest and filled it with an ache that might one day become love. Yet even as he guided her toward the wagon, waiting beyond the depot, Elias wondered what silence might still guard in her heart, and whether the world outside this moment would ever let her belong, or whether it would crush her before he could learn how to shield her. Elias helped Marielle into the wagon with a care that made his daughters stare wide-eyed, for their father was not a man often known for gentleness, and as he lifted her small bundle of possessions into the bed, the crowd behind them let their comments slip like stones in a creek, each one hitting harder than the last, words like useless, mute, and fool's wife, drifting across the platform until Elias's jaw clenched tight beneath his beard. Yet Marielle did not flinch, did not turn, only pressed the battered slate closer against her chest, as if it were armor forged from chalk and silence. The horses stamped impatiently, eager for the road, and once they were settled, Elias snapped the reins, guiding them out of town while the girls huddled close to the strange new woman who sat stiffly at their side. The road stretched wide and empty beneath the prairie sky, and though the storm of whispers had been left behind, another silence filled the space between them, heavier, more fragile, like a thin sheet of ice that might crack with any wrong word. Elias, searching for a way through it, reached into his pocket and drew out the small leather pouch that held his late wife's locket, something he had kept hidden even from himself. And without explanation he pressed it into Nora's hands and nodded toward Mariel. "Show her," he murmured, his voice softer than he intended. The girl obeyed, opening the locket to reveal a faded drawing of their mother. And though Mariel did not smile, her eyes softened, a shimmer of tears catching light as she lifted her hand in a sign Elias did not yet understand. With fumbling courage, he reached across the bench and gently touched her fingers, moving them as she had in the station, repeating the word home again, and though the gesture was clumsy, she pressed her palm briefly against his, sealing the motion as though she had granted him permission to try. The girls exchanged glances, the younger whispering, "Papa, she's nice." And for the first time since their mother's passing, Elias felt the corners of his mouth lift into something that almost resembled a smile. Yet shadows stretched long across the trail, and as they neared the distant shape of his weather-worn ranch house, Elias knew the welcome awaiting her would not be as kind as he wished. Neighbors had long memories and sharper tongues, and a deaf bride, no matter how gentle her eyes, would be an easy target for gossip. Still, as the wheels creaked and the horses slowed, he made himself a quiet vow that whatever storms might come, he would not let this fragile connection slip from his grasp, for the word she had given him on the platform was not just hers, but something he desperately needed too. And as the wagon rolled past the gate and into the yard, the air seemed to hold a promise that their silence together might yet become a language stronger than all the words the world could throw against them. The next morning, as sunlight cut across the yard and the roosters called, Mariel stepped onto the porch carrying the girls' wash in a wooden basket, her plain dress clinging damp from the labor, her hair braided loosely by Nora's careful hands, and though she moved with quiet grace, the sound of wagon wheels crunching against gravel announced visitors before Elias had time to prepare. 3 neighbors had arrived, men with hard eyes, and women who folded their arms as if to hold their judgment steady, and the eldest among them, a rancher with a thin mouth and sharper tongue, spoke loud enough for Mariel to read the shape of every cruel word, asking if Elias had gone mad bringing home a woman who could not even hear his children cry, if he thought a ranch could be kept with silence in place of speech, and though his daughters shrank back, clutching Mariel's skirts, she did not step away, but instead set the basket down carefully and stood tall, slate clutched to her chest, eyes clear as mountain water. Elias felt heat rise under his collar, fury he had not tasted since the war, and he stepped forward until he stood between her and their poison, his hand lifting in a sign he did not fully know, fingers shaped into the word she had given him, home. At first the neighbors laughed, mistaking his fumbling attempt as foolishness, but then Mariel lifted her slate, scrawling words fast and sharp. "I can cook, I can teach, I can love. What else does a house need?" She held it high, and the girls, emboldened, chimed in, their small voices echoing across the yard as they cried, "We want her. She's ours now." The laughter faltered, suspicion flickering across hard eyes, and though no hearts softened that moment, Elias knew a line had been drawn in the dust, a choice made public. He had chosen her before God and gossip alike. When the neighbors finally turned their wagons and left, muttering threats about shame and folly, Elias found himself trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had declared. And when he turned, Mariel was watching him with a softness that bent him nearly to his knees, her hand lifting uncertainly before tracing his palm in the sign for thank you. He caught her hand and pressed it briefly against his chest, over the heart that had been hollow too long. And though he could not yet say the words she deserved, he knew his silence had already begun to speak. By afternoon, the house was alive with a different kind of noise, not spoken words, but the shuffle of little feet, the scrape of chalk against slate, and the quiet laughter of two girls trying to mimic signs with clumsy fingers. For Mariel had gathered them at the table, her braid loose across her shoulder, and begun teaching Nora and Beth how to shape their hands to say bread, water, and love, gestures that made their small eyes light with wonder. Elias stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame, his arms crossed but his heart strangely unsettled as he watched his daughters smile in a way he had not seen since their mother died. A brightness born not of pity, but of discovery, as if silence had opened a new world rather than closed one. Mariel moved gently among them, correcting Nora's bent fingers with a tender touch, letting Beth trace the letters across her own palm. And when the girls clapped in triumph, she laughed, a soundless laugh, her shoulders shaking, her face glowing. And Elias felt the air tighten in his chest, for he realized he was seeing something holy, a communion made without sound. She then turned, slate in hand, and wrote swiftly, "Do you want to learn too?" holding it up for him with a tilt of her head. For a moment he hesitated. The strong rancher afraid of appearing foolish before his daughters, but Beth tugged at his sleeve, urging him forward, and so he sat, awkward at first, trying to mirror her fingers, his large hands clumsy against the delicate language, until Mariel's smile softened him, and he found himself grinning like a boy. She showed him how to sign home, how to sign father, and finally she pressed her hand against her chest, shaped it into the word heart, and then pointed at him, her eyes daring him to understand. His breath caught, and the girls gasped, whispering, "Pa, she said you're in her heart!" He had no words to give, only a rough swallow and a nod, but the warmth in the room swelled until even the silence felt loud. Yet outside, shadows lengthened and dust stirred from the road, and Elias knew whispers would spread fast. Neighbors did not forgive defiance easily, and a widow's place at his table was a challenge to their rules. Still, as Mariel sat across from him, teaching his daughters to speak without sound, Elias found himself thinking not of scandal, but of vows, the kind a man makes not in a church but in his own bones, and he knew already he was bound. 2 days later, just as the girls were chasing chickens across the yard, and Mariel was kneeling to mend a torn hem on Beth's dress, a rider's shadow stretched across the dust, the sheriff himself dismounting with boots that struck like hammers, his badge glinting in the hard sun. And Elias knew before a word was spoken that judgment had come to his door. The lawman's mouth was set like stone as he announced that folks in town had gathered a petition, that no mute bride could be considered fit for a lawful household, and that if Elias insisted on keeping her under his roof, he would answer before the council and church both. The words landed heavy, but Mariel, sensing the threat by the hush of the girls and the steel in Elias's face, clutched her slate and wrote quickly, "I am not deaf to love, I am not mute to God," lifting it high with trembling hands. The sheriff sneered, dismissing it as tricks, reminding Elias that widowers could not take in outcasts without the town's say-so, that gossip about witchcraft and curses would follow his daughters if he continued. And for a moment Elias felt the weight of it press against his ribs, the old fear of being alone again, the temptation to yield for safety's sake. But then he saw Mariel's eyes, wide, unyielding, filled with the courage of one who had been thrown away too often, and something in him broke loose. He stepped forward, his voice rough but steady, declaring in front of God, man, and sheriff alike, "This woman has given my daughters back their smiles, and you'll not tell me she cannot give this house a home." The sheriff tried to cut him down with talk of rules, but Elias, his hands shaking, raised them and signed clumsily, home, heart, love, repeating the words she had taught him, his daughters running to join him, their small fingers making the same shapes, their voices crying, "She's our ma now!" The sheriff, caught off guard by the sight, faltered, muttered that the council would decide, then swung back into his saddle and rode off in a storm of dust, leaving behind a silence heavier than gunfire. Elias turned to Mariel, his breath still hard, and she pressed the slate into his chest, where she had scrawled one single word: forever. He read it, swallowed hard, and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, knowing that the fight was only beginning. But so too was a love fierce enough to endure. By week's end, the ranch no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a fortress under watch, for neighbors began riding by slow, their eyes sharp with judgment, and whispers rose like dust storms in town that Elias Mitchell had taken a deaf bride who could not even call for help if bandits came, that his daughters would grow up cursed by silence. More than once, stones were left on the porch with scraps of paper bearing cruel words like outcast and witch, and one morning, a chicken lay dead by the fence with its neck broken, a warning no man could mistake. Elias burned with rage, but knew fists could not silence every tongue. So he poured his strength into the soil, fixing fences, planting seed, while Mariel quietly turned the inside of the house into a place of warmth so deep even fear could not chill it. She taught Nora and Beth to sign prayers at the table, and one night Elias caught them whispering in awe that Mama had sent this woman to them, because only God could have found someone who spoke without sound, yet filled every corner with song. Still, the danger sharpened when a group of men stopped Elias outside the feed store, saying he had a week to rid his house of her, or they would take it upon themselves to set things right. And though Elias's fists clenched at his sides, he thought of his girls watching from the window at home, and he forced himself to walk away, fury shaking in his bones. When he returned, Mariel met him with her slate ready, having read the truth in his eyes before he spoke, and she wrote one word: "Go?" her hand trembling, willing to leave if it meant his safety. Elias took the chalk from her fingers, pressed her hand against his chest, and scrawled the word "stay" over his heart, the letters smudging into his shirt, and the girls, wide-eyed, mimicked the sign for stay until the room filled with it, a vow multiplied by 4. That night, with the lamps low and storm clouds gathering again outside, Elias sat awake with his rifle across his knees. But when Mariel silently came to sit beside him, slipping her hand into his, he realized that no threat outside could undo the bond already forged, and the cliffhanger lingered like thunder. When the men returned, would love be enough to hold the line? The storm broke long after sundown, not with rain, but with the crunch of hooves and the flare of lanterns bobbing in the dark. 6 men riding up the lane, their voices carrying sharp in the night air as they called Elias out, declaring they'd not have a deaf woman in their valley, that his daughters would not be raised by a curse, and that if he would not drive her off, they would. Elias stepped onto the porch with his rifle in hand, his shoulders squared, while inside Mariel clutched the girls to her skirts, her heart pounding though no sound reached her ears. Only the vibration of boots striking the ground and the tremor in the floorboards as the men dismounted. The leader spat in the dirt, demanding an answer, saying the council had spoken though no paper bore its seal. And Elias, his voice ringing hard against the night, told them plain that no man would dictate who shared his roof, that his daughters had chosen their mother and he had chosen his wife in everything but word, and that the first hand laid on her would meet the barrel he carried. The standoff stretched long, breath thick with menace, until the door creaked and Mariel stepped out, slate clutched to her chest. Her hands trembling as she scrawled in chalk, "I am no curse, I am love," She held it high, her eyes bright with tears that refused to fall, and Nora and Beth rushed to her side, mimicking the signs she had taught them, their small fingers shaping mother and stay. The men faltered, their certainty shaken by the sight of children signing devotion in the dark. And though some cursed under their breath, one younger rider shifted uneasily, finally muttering that maybe it was not their place to decide. Fury rippled among the rest, but the moment of hesitation was enough. Elias lifted his rifle higher, daring them to test his resolve. And in the silence that followed, the storm inside him broke into words. "This is my home. She is my heart. Leave now, or you'll find I've nothing else to lose." The men exchanged glances, weighed the risk, then one by one mounted again, muttering threats of the council but unwilling to press further that night. When their lanterns dwindled into the dark, Elias lowered his rifle, his hands trembling, and Mariel stepped closer, her slate forgotten, as she reached up to trace her fingers across his jaw, spelling a word he understood without chalk: husband. For a long moment he could not breathe. Only held her gaze as if the night itself demanded his vow, and though no formal words had been spoken, the bond felt sealed before heaven and earth alike. 2 mornings later, while the sun still crept low across the valley, and Elias was splitting wood by the corral, a single rider approached down the lane. Not with menace this time, but with his hat held low in respect. And when Elias straightened with axe in hand, he saw it was the youngest of the men who had stood against him, a boy hardly older than 20, his eyes shadowed with guilt. He dismounted slow, saying he hadn't come to fight, only to warn that the council meant to gather come Sunday and declare Elias's marriage unlawful, to brand Mariel no wife but property, and strip the girls of any claim to decency. Elias felt the axe handle tighten in his grip, fury rising, but before he could speak, Mariel stepped from the porch, her slate clutched to her chest, her eyes curious. The boy swallowed, then confessed his own mother had been deaf before she died, that he had watched her mocked until her last day, and that seeing Mariel stand so proud with chalk in hand had cut him deeper than any sermon. He told Elias plain that not every man in town agreed with the sheriff's cruelty, that some were ready to speak different if given courage, and he asked Elias to let Mariel attend the gathering, to show them she was no curse, but strength. Elias hesitated, for the thought of her standing before that crowd churned his gut. But Mariel lifted her slate and wrote with bold strokes, "I will go. I am not afraid." She held it high, and the boy bowed his head as if before a queen, promising he would stand beside her when the day came. That evening, inside the warm lamplight of the kitchen, Mariel sat teaching Nora and Beth to sign bride, their small fingers shaping the word with pride. And when Elias joined them, awkwardly trying to copy, Mariel laughed silently, her shoulders trembling, then leaned across the table to guide his hands with her own. For a moment, the world fell away. The shadows of Sunday forgotten, as her touch lingered and his heart thudded like a drum, and he realized that whether town or council approved or not, she already wore his vow upon her smile. But the cliffhanger loomed. Sunday was coming, and with it the judgment of a town that had never welcomed silence. Sunday came heavy as iron, the whole town crowding into the church where the council sat grim at the front, the sheriff among them with his jaw tight and his eyes full of triumph, for he believed the matter already settled, that no deaf woman could be lawful wife. No silence could lead a home. Elias walked in with shoulders squared, his daughters clutching his hands, and Mariel beside him in a simple dress, her braid pinned neat, her slate and chalk pressed like a weapon to her chest. Whispers rippled through the pews, men muttering of shame, women shaking their heads. But she did not falter. stepping forward until she stood before the council with eyes steady as stone. The sheriff began his speech, loud and cruel, speaking of weakness and curses, of children raised in silence and farms undone. But before his words could gather force, Mariel raised her slate, scrawling with quick strokes. "I have taught his daughter's words no one else could. I have given this house joy. I am wife in all but name, and God knows me true." She held it high, her hand trembling but her chin lifted, and a hush swept the room, broken only by Nora's small voice crying, "She's our mama now." Then Beth climbed onto the pew, lifting her hands to sign mother and love in the gestures Mariel had taught her, her fingers clumsy but shining with pride. The crowd gasped, some in wonder, some in anger, but before doubt could return, Elias stepped beside them, his voice low but fierce, declaring, "This woman saved my girls, saved me, and I'll not let any man call her less than wife." He turned, fumbling but determined, raising his hands to sign home, heart forever, each motion echoing the vow he could not frame in words, and the sight of a rancher's broad hands bent to silent language broke something loose in the crowd. A murmur spread. The young rider from before stepping forward to say his own mother had been deaf, and that no counsel could judge a heart God himself had blessed. The sheriff sputtered, called it folly, but the weight of the people shifted, heads nodding, murmurs swelling until even the council wavered. And though no verdict was given that moment, the tide had turned, leaving the sheriff red-faced and Mariel trembling with silent tears. Elias took her hand, lifted it high for all to see, and though no preacher stood before them, the air felt thick with witness, as if the vow had already been spoken in heaven's tongue. When the council scattered and the townsfolk drifted away, some still muttering but most subdued, Elias led Mariel and the girls out beneath the open sky, where the late sun spilled gold across the valley, and there, before the whole of heaven, if not the approval of every neighbor, he turned to her with his hands trembling and his heart pounding like hooves in his chest. Mariel clutched her slate, chalk ready, but Elias gently pushed it aside, his voice low as he told her, "I don't need their papers. I don't need their blessing. You're my wife now if you'll have me." Her eyes widened, shining wet, and slowly she raised her hands, shaping the word she had given him long ago, home. She pressed her palm against his chest, over the heart that had held silence too long, and then shaped another word, forever. The girls, breathless with joy, rushed forward, tugging at her skirts, crying, "Say yes, Ma, say yes!" And Mariel laughed silently, scribbling one last word on the slate. Yes. Elias took the chalk from her fingers, scrawled his own clumsy yes beside hers, and together they lifted it toward the fading light, as if to sign their vow in the very sky. In that moment, it did not matter that the sheriff glared from the church steps, nor that whispers would linger in the valley. What mattered was that love had spoken without sound, strong enough to echo beyond words. He pulled her close, his lips brushing her hair, while the girls clapped and spun in the dust, their small voices singing the family whole again, and Elias Redfeather, who carried this tale, would tell it as proof that silence could thunder louder than any crowd, and that one word, signed, written, or simply lived, was enough to bind two hearts until the end of days. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her stand before the council, slate trembling in her hands, would you have spoken up for her too? Tell us in the comments.